This whole thing about extra dimensions being talked about on YouTube is bugging me lately because I don't feel like people understand the physicality underneath it. You know, when because you have three dimensions, right? You understand from three dimensions that two-dimensional spaces and one-dimensional spaces only exist as like relative experiences based on the senses of the creature and the relative size and so on, like how we use the um whatchamacallit, the analogs with ants, and how, like, if we were ants and we had to be on a piece of paper, it'd be two-dimensional. But it's not, because an ant can go underneath the paper and go around, and if it connects to a surface, they can transfer to another surface. And obviously they do comprehend or understand three dimensions enough to traverse them. So bleeding in, or I don't know how to describe this, because extra dimensions are really hard to describe. So I understand that nobody is really good at describing them, including me. You don't have, because we talk about them like they're magical. We talk about a lot of things like they're magical, but then you can't explain them. And even when you explain them, it's like, oh, that sounds magical, but you still realize eventually that you're still talking about physics, which all physics do in some sense have their limits and rules, including quantum physics, but they have different rules. They have very different rules that kind of contradict macro physics. That's really what it is. It's not that they have no rules, but in certain senses, I guess they have no rules, like in the fact that waves and particles, but a dimension. So the etymological definition of a dimension is a direction, right? But the way that I see a dimension is more so in a three-dimensional sense of, like, because in order to understand a fourth dimension or a fifth dimension, you would need to go beyond the third somehow, right? But then when scientists talk about how these extra dimensions may actually be micro dimensions, you see it's not like fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. It's actually infinite dimensions. And somehow it has more to do with what a dimension can encompass or does encompass. And that dimension is defined somehow by a set of processes or relations that tie together things and other processes over a distance, and through directions, obviously many directions. In one sense, you can do that as having a macro process which is somehow happening in a micro process, and is contained inside of that micro process, and so that is somehow a micro dimension. And I think that your cells specifically they all contain some sort of like range of micro dimensions, which are they exist relative to microorganisms like inside of your body, and that those exist all throughout nature, and that you can have in a similar sense, but in a very different way, you can have a dimension that's created by the activities of a species. We don't necessarily have, we actually do. No, we have the internet. Okay, the internet is a whole dimension. It doesn't really exist in the way that we can understand, but it exists, and it actually does exist physically, just not in the way that we want to acknowledge that it exists physically. It exists physically, though. The bits and all the stuff happening on your screen is happening inside of the machine, and the network stuff is happening inside of machines all around the world. All that stuff is physical, but it's a whole dimension, and it's technically one dimension that has many dimensions inside of it. So it's almost like its own multiverse now of dimensions, which is really weird, but in a sense, I think that's a good way of describing it. And you have a very, like, this is sort of going down like a spectrum. There's a similar process that could happen with, let's say, aliens. right? Let's say aliens have teleportation technology. And if you assume that you have teleportation technology, that technology must be able to transmit everything from particles to molecules all the way up to macro structures, right? So then go down, because you're not just going to use that for macro structures. You're going to use that for all kinds of stuff. You're going to use that for messages. You're going to use that for packages. You're going to use that for everything. And so if an alien species were to create a network of teleporters that have this, range of usability, I guess, there would be a dimension, or many, maybe the same thing, a multiverse of dimensions that these, structures create. And so there should be similar things going on with basically anything you can think of that involves complex processes happening on a range of scales. And then you factor in quantum, what do you call it? Quantum entanglement, spooky action. And now if you can leverage quantum entanglement or spooky action, you can also create more dimensions of information flowing over vast distances. As for micro dimensions, as in like contained, like complex processes, we only know as much as we can see. And for everything else now, this is all speculation. So like you can see examples of what I'm talking about in the former in microbiology. You can see examples of the latter in the internet, but then all the other things are, again, speculation. We don't know if any of that is happening. We just have to assume that it might be. And then in turn, when we talk about, like alien sightings, and right now I'm watching the Earth's Mantis Overlords by the Y Files, and I haven't hit the end yet. I don't know if there's going to be like a debunk. But just like in general, this concept of, even with the gods, like the old gods and the angels and shit, of like being able of having these dimensions that they travel through, we really mystify that too much. Like I've said this with many things, many videos that I've uploaded. Like there are these concepts that get over mystified, basically, and there's no need for that. But then people don't really know how to reconcile all of the language being leveraged to describe dimensions with what they understand about physics, in order to sort of like place it somewhere and anchor it in reality. And this stuff doesn't work unless it's anchored in reality. A lot of people are in this headspace of like, well, maybe reality is not real, and that's why this works. No, reality is real in the sense of like the stuff that we know about is real. What is causing it, we don't know. And in that sense, this could be a simulation, but it's a real simulation, as in something could have spurred this on. Something could be generating this and giving it power. We don't know for sure. But what we do know about like particles and atoms and all that stuff, that is real. We also know that virtual particles do act in what we consider to be very virtual ways, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, well, actually, it definitely doesn't mean that macro particles are just computer generated. They're not. Macro particles are very real, and, they have to be converted. They can't be destroyed. Get what I'm saying? Like energy is energy. And with the virtual particle stuff, we just don't understand what's actually happening. But we do know through enough observation that macro particles follow macro rules unless they are interfered with. So that's the important thing. This is real. When something changes, there is interference. And so you have to consider like, okay, anchoring in reality, what is that interference? What was true before, what changed, what could possibly have made that change, and so on. And so we have to apply these same kinds of mindsets to anything that's going to be like super fucking weird and magical. Like, for example, power coming from the pyramids, the Sumerian creation story, which is absolutely fucking wacky, and totally violates all of my concepts of what like I guess this other sense of dimensions, the measurements of reality are, because it describes things that really do not respect the measurements of like Earth and its relationship to space and its relationship to the sun and so on. But it also describes levels of interference and kinds of interference that we have no examples of in the modern world. We have no ways of knowing what those things actually do if they exist. We don't know where they could be now if they exist. We also know that they sound absurd, but then we have dozens, hundreds of cultures all describing similar things from different angles, and being on different levels, strangers to each other. So I don't know. This is all I wanted to talk about in this video, is like just a little rant on dimensions. I feel like a lot of people just kind of have this, again, like weirdly magical take, or like weirdly magical sort of comprehension of what they are, and it doesn't have to be so magical when you are, you know, actively anchoring yourself in reality, and then you start to see how these things can exist, and then you start to see that it actually does, like when you see the ways in which it can exist, these dimensions, it actually does explain why people would associate that with, for example, aliens and the things that aliens have been reportedly able to do through, you know, ancient history and modern history, right? Like through technology. And in like as a sort of advent of that technology, they are creating these extra dimensions or extra directions in which information is flowing, and not just full bodies, but also possibly every other form of information, particles, macro structures that you can think of. Maybe they can transport whole buildings through channels in the universe that are smaller than an atom, and they just have the technology to do that. We just don't fucking know. But it, again, would kind of explain the behavior that we've described. So, I don't know. It's just a thought, just a weird thought, just building on what I've been thinking for some years now.